Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry for the logistic issues we had. Welcome to another webinar in our Metrics of Regulation series. I'm Nir Kosti, and although my co-host David Levy-Fauri is unfortunately unable to join us today, we continue our exploration of new approaches to studying and measuring regulation. We live in an era of expanding regulation with growing rule stocks, and our goal is to examine innovative ways to measure regulation, which includes analyzing its size and scope, burden, content, public perception, sentiment, and more. And today we have a very special guest with us, Steffen Hurka from Zeppelin University. Stefan will discuss his research on policy complexity along his new ERC project. And I will shortly introduce Stefan, and then he will give a 30 or more minute presentation, followed by a Q&A session. So let's start with a short introduction. Stefan holds the chair of European politics at Zeppelin University, where he leads the ERC DEMOLAW project that he will discuss later. Since 2019, he has also directed the Emmy Noether Junior Research Group EUPLEX, Policy Complexity in the European Union. He earned his PhD from the University of Constance in 2015 and previously worked as a postdoctoral researcher at LMU Munich's Geschwister-Scholl Institute. His research focuses on EU legislative processes, the organization of the European Parliament, and democratic legislation. Stefan, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen real quick. Where is it? There it is. Okay, hope did that work? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, also thank you very much for the kind invitation, Nir, and of course also David, who's not here today, but maybe he can watch this online later, so he won't miss anything. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk a bit about my and our research on policy complexity of the past couple of years. Here's a quick overview of what I want to do. This is quite a lot. Maybe I'll skip some things since we already lost some time. I will start out by saying a bit about the question, why should we actually care about policy complexity? Why is this an important thing? And then talk about the thing that most of you are very interested in is how can we measure it? But then I'll also give you some empirical evidence of the things that we found out over the past couple of years, some descriptive empirical evidence of how policy complexity has evolved over the course of the past decades in the European Union. Then I'll talk a bit about the origins of this complexity. So where does this complexity come from? And I'll specifically talk about three of those origins: political, institutional, and administrative origins. And then I'll talk briefly about two papers that came out also in the past 2 years on the consequences of policy complexity. Firstly, on the legislative organization in the EP, and then for implementation performance in the member states. And then in the end, I will also talk a bit about the new project, which is only just beginning and which is still very, very, very preliminary still at the moment. But I'll talk about the core ideas of this project as well. And what I should say in the beginning is that many of the things that I will present in the next minutes are not exclusively only my own work, but were done with Konstantin, who's also here today, Konstantin Kaplana, and Maximilian Haag, who is now at GESIS in Cologne. So that should be mentioned transparently in the very beginning. All right, so I'd like to start out with something that might strike you as a bit counterintuitive in the beginning, but when you look around in the world today, we see a lot of people that offer very, very simple solutions to very, very complex questions and very, very complex problems. So it's important to understand that all I will say in the next couple of minutes should be always evaluated against the background that those complex policies might sometimes really cause problems, but they might sometimes also be better than simple policies. Because for every complex problem, and this is what H.L. Mencken once said, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And when we look around the world these days, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So that's the one side. We should also be able to celebrate our ability to formulate complex policies and not only condemn it all the time. So there's a positive aspect to this complexity. But on the other hand, there's of course also several downsides and several threats to our democratic political systems that come with this complexity. And one of them is a danger of decreasing compliance. So policy complexity has been shown, and we all basically get this general idea when we think back to the COVID crisis and all the regulations that we had. And at some point, nobody really even understood what they were doing. And they were so super complex that people weren't even able to follow them. And then we have some research on tax code complexity, and everybody who ever filed a tax declaration can relate to that. So also this complexity leads to a decreasing ability and also sometimes willingness to actually be able to comply with those complex policies. So this is a potential downside of increasing policy complexity. And another downside is policy evaluation, or what we often term evidence-based policy making. So very often we're no longer able to really evaluate what's working and what is not if the policies we want to evaluate increase excessively in complexity. So there are several examples out there. I won't go into detail about them, but the core problem here is really that we're no longer able to tell what works and what doesn't if the underlying policies become excessively complex. And then the third issue that might be caused by increasing policy complexity is that we're no longer really able to discuss and deliberate the pros and cons of different policy options, because we simply shift the policy discourse into expert arenas, simply because we're no longer really able to understand what those policies are really about and are no longer able to really discuss the pros and cons. And this is, of course, an issue for any democratic political system in terms of its legitimacy. So those are some of the background questions that drove me to apply for this research grant, EUPLEX, which started in 2019 and is now running at Zeppelin University in Friedrichshafen, and will still run throughout this year. And we still have several things to do in this project, but I'll talk about a bit what we found out already. And the main three questions that we sought to answer in this project and sought to approach were, first, what is actually this policy complexity? How can we really conceptualize what policy complexity is? And how can we translate those conceptual ideas into measurable variables, so to speak? Then the second question is an analytical one, namely the question of why does this complexity even vary across political systems? Why does it vary across time? Why does it vary across different institutional settings? And the third question that we wanted to address was, how does this complexity even affect political systems and political processes, from institutional adaptation to complexity to the implementation stage? So those were basically the three main research questions that we tried to address in this project. And when it comes to the conceptual question of what complexity is, there are thousands of potential options to really conceptualize this. What we did in this project is we decided to not reinvent the wheel and rather build on a concept that was first developed in the United States context. And this approach starts from the idea that you have potential hypothetical end users of a policy, of a law. And this end user is trying somehow to internalize the content or the substance of this policy. So this can be a bureaucrat, lawyer, corporation, citizen, you name it. Those can be very different types of end users, but somehow they all try to gain knowledge, extract information from the legislative text that carries the policy content. And the main idea here is now that the complexity of a policy can be affected by three different main sources. And the first one is the one that people usually have in mind first, and that's the structure. So basically, the length and the depth of a policy. How is it structured? How voluminous is it? How detailed is it? So the structure of the law is the first major source of this complexity. And then the second source, which is not really discussed, which hasn't been discussed to the same degree in the literature, is the question of how the policy is formulated. So the linguistic basics, the linguistic foundations of this complexity. So you can formulate a policy in very simple terms, or you can use extremely complicated language and different syntactic and semantic structures to carry forward the meaning of the policy. And this can, of course, happen in short text and in long text. So this is not necessary. The way the policy is formulated is not necessarily directly related to the question, to the first question of how it's structured. And then we have the third aspect, and that's an aspect that most people will also immediately have in mind when they think about complexity, and that's more or less interaction effects, right? Interaction between individual articles in a law, or interaction between the law or the broader context, the broader legal landscape, and the extent to which the law is embedded in this legal landscape. So this is what we call relational policy complexity. So those are the three factors that we basically take from the literature and translate into the European Union setting: structure, language, and relationality, so to speak. And together, jointly, those components affect the efficiency of you as the end user, or the costs that you as an end user face when you're confronted with a set of rules and try to somehow extract their meaning, right? And so there's a very nice paper by our colleague Roman Senninger from Aarhus in 2023 in PSRM, where we actually tested this and validated this on the individual level. And there are several things that really strongly relate to what I just said. So especially the relational factors were shown to really matter a lot for the perceived complexity of laws. Okay, so those are the three aspects that we use in order to conceptualize this policy complexity. And then we translated this into indicators, so to speak. So we've got here those three different components: structural, linguistic, and relational. And each of those conceptual components came now with two different indicators. The first one was length, and you can use the number of words, you can use the number of policy elements in the text, basically anything that somehow gives you an idea of how long the law is. And then the second one is detail, and what we use here is a so-called average element depth. So this is simply an indicator that tells you something about how specific and how detailed the structure of the legislative tree is, so to speak. So if it's very detailed, you've got lots of points and indents on the very low level, or if it's very general and you basically only have articles of a single paragraph. So those are basically matters of detail, how deep is the hierarchical structure that you find in the law. Then the linguistic components are also twofold. The first one here is word entropy, which basically gives you an idea of how diverse the language is that you find in the law. So how diverse the concepts are that are featured in the law. That's what we capture with word entropy. And then we have the second component, that's readability. So that's rather the syntactical formulation of the text. So how easily is it digestible in syntactic terms, long words in sentences, so to speak, and you can approximate this through different readability scores. What we usually use then is the LIC score here. I won't go into detail about how this is measured, but you get the general idea. And then the relational aspects are measured through connectivity and interdependence. So what I just said, it's basically the idea that you can have laws that are more or less independent of the broader legal landscape and don't interact very much with this legal landscape, or it's tightly embedded in that legal landscape and features a lot of external references to those laws. And then within the law, you can also have laws that feature articles that heavily depend on each other for interpretation and implementation, or laws that don't. So those are the different aspects that get into this complexity measure that we have. What you can then do, of course, is you can analyze those different measures separately, because they also mean different things. But you can also, of course, build a complexity score out of this to, of course, make the analysis of complexity not too complex itself. That's also often sometimes a nice thing to do, to somehow integrate this. And this is what we often do, is to use a complexity score, which is a standardized average of those indicators, and track them over time, policy domains, and so on. Okay, some descriptives. Those are just 3 of those indicators. That's length, so the number of words, textual difficulty, and interdependence, so the internal references per article, and those are tracked over time here for several thousand laws since 1994 to 2023 in the EU. And of course, I mean, the picture that you get is pretty clear, right? There's a pretty strong increase in complexity, and that's really the case regardless of how you measure it. It's not always completely linear, so sometimes you've got ups and downs, especially now what you can see here is during election years, right? So 2014, 2019, the proposals that come out of the Commission tend to be less complex than during non-election years. So those are some non-linear trends that you have over time, but in general, the general increase is pretty dramatic, right? So especially when you look at length, I always say that in the early 19s, what the average length of a EU law was basically a research note, and now it's a full-blown APSR article, right, so to speak. So this is more or less the dimension that you can look at. And of course, right, textual difficulty was always high. Obviously, those are EU laws, right? But it even increased over time here as well at a very high level. And really, this is more or less independent of how you measure this. Then what you can also see is that in the short run, you can also see some interesting dynamics. And this is something that I just pointed towards, is that you typically see the most complex legislation coming out of the Commission around the middle of the legislative cycle, right? So in the beginning, the Commission needs a lot of time to prepare those complex proposals. And in the end, it lacks the time to get it through the legislative process before the new elections. So this is also, there's some cyclical trends during those legislative cycles that always need to be taken into account when we try to explain why this complexity varies. And then, of course, what you can also see is that there is quite some substantial variance across policy domains. Yeah, so you have different baseline complexities, so to speak, when you look at different policy domains. But what is even more striking is that you get even a lot of variance in terms of complexity if you hold the policy domain constant. So there's quite a lot of variation even within policy domains. And in my view, or in our view, this is really where it gets interesting, right? Because even if you hold those different things constant, you still see a lot of variance that needs to be explained. And what I want to get into now a bit is this analytical question of how can we actually explain this? Why does this complexity vary? And I want to highlight 3 different explanations that we looked into. So one of those, and this is now, again, a very complex graph, and my PhD students always hate me for using those contour plots, but still I'll try to explain this in the best way possible now, so forget about all of this. I mean, what this essentially shows you, and this is what I tested for an article a couple of years ago, is how the distribution of preferences that you find in a decision-making body, in this case, the European Commission, College of Commissioners in the European Commission. So how the distribution of preferences in that decision-making body affects the complexity of the policy compromises that come out of this decision-making body. And what this basically tells you here is that when you're right in the middle, so at 0 and 0, you've got an average degree of preference heterogeneity. So they are not completely united, but they're also not completely not united. So they're really sort of in the middle. And once you move to the upper right and upper left corners of this plot, it gets darker. And what this tells you is that the more preference heterogeneity you get in a decision-making body, the more complex the policy compromises become that come out of this decision-making process. So political preferences make a huge difference for the complexity of the policy outputs that you get. And what's very interesting here is that when you move to the lower corners of those graphs, so in those instances, preference heterogeneity is very low, you get much simpler solutions. So what this basically tells you is that if you put together a bunch of very like-minded but very extreme people, the solutions they will come up with are relatively simple, right? And the more those preferences diverge and the more difficult the compromise building becomes, the more complex the solutions will eventually become that come out of this. And I find this interesting in the sense that this is based on European Commission evidence, which is in many ways, one could argue, a least likely case for those patterns, right? Because this is a highly technocratic body, at least we thought so. And people always said, you know, politics should not matter that much in the European Commission. But if it even matters that much in the European Commission, as I can show here, it should matter even more in the national setting. So when you think of very diverse governing coalitions in certain countries, when you think back of the recent German coalition, for example, that was extremely diverse and even broke over this. So the compromises or the policies that come out of such diverse governing bodies will be extremely complex. So there's a political origin that we can identify for those complex policies. And then there's also an institutional origin, and this is how we design the decision-making process. So how inclusively we design the decision-making process. So on the left-hand side, what you see is policies coming out of the consultation procedure in the EU, which is essentially a unicameral procedure where only the council effectively decides over the policy, and the proposals that come out of this are significantly less complex than the ones the Commission produces when the European Parliament also has a say and acts as an additional chamber in the decision-making process. Now, this is, of course, really only correlation, right? So this does not necessarily tell you whether there's actually a causal effect of introducing co-decision into a second chamber to the decision-making process, whether this actually really affects the complexity of the proposals agenda setters produce in the political process. So this is why I recently did another study where I try to use a difference in differences approach, which what I do here is essentially what I exploit, so to speak, is what happened in the Treaty of Lisbon. And some of you might be familiar with European Union politics. So what happened in the Treaty of Lisbon was a severe expansion of the co-decision procedure. So introducing a second chamber to the legislative process. And this happened especially for agriculture and fisheries. So agriculture and fisheries was, so to speak, a treated group. So this group of policies experienced the change to co-decision, so the addition of the European Parliament as an additional veto player in the process. On the other hand, you had taxation, so tax harmonization, which has always been dealt with under the unicameral procedure and was not changed during this change in Lisbon. And what you can do then is to exploit this in a diff approach. And what this shows you here is that you had relatively parallel trends before the Lisbon Treaty kicked in, and then the Lisbon Treaty came, and the complexity of the proposals the Commission came up with increased significantly in agriculture and fisheries, but not so much in taxation. So there's at least some causal, we can at least assume some causality here with regard to the anticipation of the Commission. So the Commission basically anticipates the more uncertain bargaining environment and the more, the higher uncertainty that's associated with the positions of the veto players, and accommodates and anticipates this in the original proposal. So the bottom line here is the more inclusively you design a decision-making process, the more people or the more actors can actually have a say in the outcome, the more complex the proposals already become, the agenda setter sends into the process. Okay, so the real bottom line is that this is more or less a price of democracy, right? So the more inclusively you design those processes, the more complex the outputs will eventually become. All right. So, and then what we did recently is we looked into a third aspect that's also very important, because one could always argue that, you know, there's political and institutional scope conditions that drive certain incentives for agenda setters, for legislative institutions. But on the other hand, this policy formulation process really happens at the administrative level, at least especially in the European Commission. And so we thought, okay, maybe there's also something interesting here. And I did a paper together with Will Daniel from the University of Nottingham. It was published recently. And there we look at people in the European Commission who are actually responsible for formulating policy proposals. I mean, not directly responsible, but they are the ones who eventually clear the proposal before it gets to the College of Commissioners. And Will and his student assistants did a nice job of really going through CVs of cabinet members in the European Commission and coding them for demographic aspects, so gender, nationality, and so on and so forth. And so the key question then was, and we combined this then with this complexity data, and the key question we asked ourselves was, does the diversity of those cabinets, so how diversely those cabinets are put together, does this affect the complexity of the policy output? Because one could assume that the more views you get in, the more backgrounds of people you get in, the more complex the compromise might become that comes out of this process. Now, a long story short, doesn't happen, okay? So diversity does not adversely affect the complexity of the policy proposals the Commission produces. It does not. So this is in many ways this is good news for the Commission, right? So because you can increase the diversity of the teams that produce the policy, but you do not get any adverse consequences for the complexity of the proposals that are cleared by those cabinets. An interesting side finding that we found is that, you know, it's still important how you put the team together. So if you put a lot of lawyers into those cabinets, the complexity of the proposals increases. And this is not really a selection effect. One could, of course, assume that, you know, lawyers self-select into more complex policy domains, but this is even if you hold the domain constant and add lawyers, you can find this effect, right? So this is the one key thing that we found, that, you know, the composition of the team also can make a difference for the complexity of policies. Okay, so those are the three things. Political, institutional, and administrative factors can actually drive the complexity of those policy outputs. In the next part, I'll talk a bit about the consequences of this complexity. And here we look, and I'll probably go through this rather quickly because I'm already running out of time a little. What we looked at here is how the complexity of a legislative proposal affects how the legislature, in our case the European Parliament, has to adapt its internal proceedings. So the complexity of a commission proposal can affect how the European Parliament has to organize its legislative business. And in particular, we looked at how the complexity of the proposal puts pressure on committees in the European Parliament to distribute the duty to report on the proposal to specific individual MEPs. So it puts pressure on the European Parliament to select particularly experienced MEPs for particularly complex proposals. And this is what we effectively find, is that this really does make a lot of difference. And so the more complex the proposal becomes, the more likely it becomes that a very experienced MEP gets to report on the proposal. And this is important mainly for the reason that the European Parliament typically doesn't have a whole lot of political experience in its ranks, because it has a relatively high turnover rate. And now when you combine this with the finding that complexity tends to increase very much over time, but the European Parliament tends to lose a lot of its staff, a lot of its members with every successive election, that is, of course, a huge problem for the European Parliament in terms of how efficiently it can actually deal with those complex policies. So this is one important aspect. And of course, this also means that the agenda setters of the Commission wields a lot of power in terms of how it can also affect internal proceedings in the European Parliament by calibrating and the complexity of its legislative proposals, also strategically. Okay, I'll skip this one. You can read, of course, I put in the references. If you're interested in this, you can also always look this up. This is all open access online. Now, the final point on the EUPLEX project is something that we looked in last year, which is on the quality of implementation. Because I said in the beginning, there's of course a huge threat that excessively complex policies lead to dysfunctional or bad implementation in the member states. And interestingly, the literature on this is rather contradictory, which is mainly because the empirical coverage varies quite a lot across different studies. And then complexity is typically approximated rather roughly by using the directive's recitals and not its enacting terms. And the recitals are, of course, important, but they don't have any direct legal effects, and they aren't implemented directly, right? So what really matters for the substance is the enacting terms, not the recitals. So we looked at roughly 1,000 directives in all member states and policy domains, and first looked at the direct effect. So how does complexity affect implementation performance? Then we looked in the second hypothesis, does this complexity, can this somehow be cushioned by capacity? So if you increase your administrative capacity, can you somehow dampen those negative side effects of policy complexity? And in the third hypothesis, we expected that EU skeptic governments might be even less willing to carry or to pay the increasing costs of complexity, especially when it comes from the EU, which would further decrease their implementation performance. So those are the three main hypotheses that we tested here. And we looked at different measures of implementation performance, but I'll only focus on two of them now, which is transposition, so the act of translating the directive into national law, and the infringement proceedings, so whether or not the Commission decides to actually sue a member state for non-compliance. And what we found first is a very clear and very strong direct effect of complexity. So the complexity affects the transposition process. Complexity affects the probability that you badly apply the law and get drawn to court. So this is a very strong direct effect. And then we found that effectively you can only do so much by increasing your administrative capacity, because those policies are so complex that the amount of problem solving that you can actually do by increasing your administrative capabilities is very limited. There is a small effect, but it's really small. Okay, so states are really struggle with this excessive complexity by the European Union. And interestingly, we found that the Commission is particularly hesitant to sue EU skeptic governments for non-compliance when the complexity of the directive increases. And we found this pretty interesting because it might signify that the Commission is really strategic with regard to the court battles it's willing to pick, right? So if it might just consider it more costly to lose to a EU skeptic government when in court, and might be more hesitant to actually sue the EU skeptic government when the legal situation is more uncertain, which is rather the case when the directive might be extremely complex. So this is in a nutshell what we found in this paper on implementation. Okay, to sum this up, we argue that the complexity of EU laws is determined by structure, language, and interdependence. So those are the three main sources of complexity. We find pretty strong increases in this complexity over time and substantial variance across and within policy domains. There are different factors that can jointly explain variance in this complexity. And there are several different consequences for political processes. There's also quite some substantial consequences for the efficiency of legislative negotiations. I didn't even talk about this now. This is in another paper. But there's substantial consequences for the way the EP is able to organize its legislative business and the quality of the implementation in the member states. We still work on several other topics that are still in our cupboard and that we're still working on. So for example, how does complexity change during legislative negotiations? to what extent does the success of interest groups during policy formulation depend on the complexity of the substance matter and the resources of the interest group. So those are some of the things that we're currently working on. Okay, to close, I will then now very briefly talk a bit about the new project, which in many ways builds on the things that we looked at in this in the EUPLEX project, but goes a lot deeper, because this is really based on a dissatisfaction I had with the EUPLEX project, because EUPLEX is in a way those measures are meaningful, and we see that they really matter for several things. But they don't really get to the substance of the legislation. So what we really measure is text-based metrics of the laws, right? So what we try to do in DEMOLAW is really solve this to some degree and be able to conceptualize, measure, and compare the substance that is really contained in democratic legislation, and really trace this along with the legislative designs that come with this substance. And then in the second thing that we want to look at is, why does this design of democratic laws actually vary across policy domains, political systems, and time? And then we want to find out what makes a law actually stable in the long run. So why are some laws highly fragile and basically die within a very short time? And why are others much more stable and maintained carefully in the long run? So those are some of the questions that we try to answer in this project. So basically the whole idea is to bring some order to this chaos that you see in those pictures, because all of this, if we imagine we're all constantly confronted by laws and regulations all the times, to the extent that we don't even take notice anymore. So what we really try to do in this project is to bring some order to this chaos, and to be able to somehow find some commonalities across legislation, across different political systems, in how they solve certain policy problems. And the conceptual foundation for this is basically the idea that legislative designs should be defined by two main dimensions. And the first one is what we call versatility, and the second one is what we call precision. And versatility here relates to the diversity of the law in terms of the amount or the diversity of topics, addressees, and instruments that are being contained in the law. So you can imagine that there are certain laws that are extremely directed at individual topics and very targeted at individual topics. And since I've worked on this, gun laws are extremely good example for this. So those laws are extremely targeted to a very specific topic, while others, just think of the Inflation Reduction Act recently, are extremely broad and cover multiple topics at once, and they're interdependent and so on. And then there's a variety of policy addressees that can be addressed. So you can have very targeted laws that are addressed at very individual addressees, or you can have laws that are very variant here and address multiple addressees at once. And the same goes for policy instruments. So some laws are very one-dimensional in terms of the policy instruments they use, mainly, for example, prohibitions or tax-based incentives or information incentives or whatever, and others are extremely diverse in that regard. So this is basically, those are the three things that feed into this versatility dimension. And the second dimension is what I call the precision dimension here. And those are essentially also three things. The first one is dilution. What's called dilution here is basically the vagueness of the law. So how vaguely is the law formulated? How indeterminate are the legal concepts that are being used in the law? The second one is derogation. So how generally applicable are the provisions of the law, and to what extent are certain things accepted? And the third one is delegation. And I think Nir is the main expert here on this. He can probably say much more on this than I can. But the key idea is, of course, you can solve certain things in the law, but then you can, of course, also delegate power to solve other things in the bureaucracy, for example. So if you put this together and do the beloved 2x2 that all political scientists really like a lot, you end up with those four ideal types of legislative designs that I labeled this way. And so sledgehammer laws, for example, are extremely versatile. So you can think of a sledgehammer being able to, destroy pretty much everything, but it's not very precise, right? And on the other extreme, you've got scalpel laws that are really designed to fulfill one specific purpose, but that are extremely precise in what they do. And then you've got the hybrids, and here the Swiss Army knife is probably the one that's probably most interesting from a normative perspective because it's very versatile and very precise, but it might also be very difficult to agree on a Swiss Army knife law. And then you've got the shotgun, which is the final, more or less the final law, which is low on versatility and low on precision. So this is basically just gives us a language to think of those different dimensions that feed into a legislative design. Whether those are eventually the dimensions that we end up finding is something that I don't know yet. It's just something that I would expect us to find based on the literature on public policy and the literature on law. Those are, in my view, the interesting and important aspects that we are interested in. But maybe there's a third dimension that we haven't thought of yet. This is something, maybe I come back in 2 or 3 years and let you know what we actually found. At the moment, this is just theory. So the empirical foundation is legislative texts in 3 political systems, the EU, the United States, and the UK. The idea is to maximize variance with regard to the institutional design. And of course, this also comes with the challenge that those different systems are also very different in terms of their legal traditions and other things, right? So this is a huge challenge, and we'll see how far we can actually compare across those systems. I mean, ideally, we should be able to. If not, then we can only compare within those systems, but we'll see about that. So there's a large quantitative component, of course, to this. We'll use rule-based and machine learning approaches to approximate this. And we'll also see how far LLMs will get you with will get us with the measurement. But there's also a qualitative component, especially for the third working package when it comes to maintenance and survival. Then we'll also select certain interesting cases for case studies and process tracing. All right, so maybe, I don't know, Nir, should I still explain this example here, or should I stop?
Yeah, I think perhaps just conclude and we'll start.
Okay. Okay. Maybe then I just say, I mean, this is those are the core. I mean, I can tell about this later. So this is just an example that I have to illustrate those different concepts here, but I won't talk about this now. So the 3 main contributions I envision are first to offer this conceptual language on legislative designs that allows us to somehow talk about this in a more systematic way. Then, of course, there's a methodological aspect to it, because we try to advance what I would call computational public policy and to somehow make this, to scale this up to a larger dimension by using those new tools of NLP. And then there's, of course, also the idea to have a major theoretical contribution here and to offer an integrated theoretical framework on law creation and survival. That's what we love to do. And I'll tell you in a couple of years whether it actually worked out. Okay, now I hope, I think 45 minutes, this is what I took. So hope that's okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for this really inspiring and interesting talk. Well done for your really impressive work as well, and congratulations for your new project. We have some time for Q&A now, so perhaps anyone wants to ask something or to give a feedback. Just please answer the screen, Stefan, then we can have...
Oh, yes.
Okay, and I see Marcus. So Marcus, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was most interesting and very informative. I wanted to ask you if you had differentiated in any way between European directives and regulations. And because I know you differentiate between the subject matter, but have you found any kind of differences in terms of complexity of the 2 categories?
Yes, we differentiated between those. So thanks for the question, first of all. Interestingly, what we found is that there's really not much of a difference in terms of complexity anymore. I mean, we had some, we see a little convergence trend actually over time that those two, and this is also in line with the law literature, at least as far as I understand it, is that those different legal instruments become increasingly alike. So directives become ever more detailed and become even more similar to regulations over time. And so the complexity between those two is really comparable. So it's very similar. It's, of course, it's a lot higher, of course, than the complexity of decisions, right? So we've got a lot of decisions, obviously, but those tend to be of much lower complexity than directives and regulations. And of course, I mean, now for the implementation paper, we only looked at directives because those have to be transposed, obviously. But in all of the other studies, we always use all the data and then subdivide this for different legal instruments.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I see Eva, please.
Hi, thanks for this most interesting and rich and really clear presentation and some really worrying findings in a way. I have too many questions, but I will have the opportunity soon to discuss them with you. So I'll try and focus. Maybe one question is about the scope of this. So, because you've mainly looked at policy complexity in the EU. So what do you think, to what extent and in what ways could this travel to other levels of where legislations are made? Second, so I was wondering what the relation is between rule growth, because we also know that there is this constant rule growth and this growth in rule complexity. I mean, so you say, okay, it has like political reasons, but I mean, these reasons in a way have always existed, right? And still we see a further increase. And then it's not really that surprising that when you introduce a new veto player, a new chamber, that policy complexity will increase in a way, right? But still, since that has happened, since the treaty, that still has increased, right? And so I'm just wondering whether there's some sort of common cause here. That what are your thoughts about this? And then for the last 2 or 3 slides, I was just wondering, because you come up with these 2 dimensions. What was it? Precision and versatility.
Yeah.
And what is the let's say the theoretical conceptual foundation of this in relation to the more established the dimensions that others and you, I think, as well have worked with, like the intensity and the density of regulation, right?
Well, first of all, thanks for the questions. I'll just tell them the other way around because now I can remember the last question very well. So the main advantage, in my view, of this other conceptualization of this versatility and precision is that it's independent of the policy type. It's not only directed at distributional policies or regulation policies or whatever. You can basically, it's so abstract that you can more or less use it for every type of policy. And I think this is really the key advantage when you compare it, for example, to the intensity density thing. This is more or less, or when you look at generosity of distributional policies or social policies, for example, those are concepts that are very much tailored to the individual policy domain. The concept here is much broader and more abstract and tries to somehow capture very different aspects of different policy domains in one overarching concept. So that's more or less the main thing. Then the first question was about how does this travel to other empirical contexts, right? So other countries, more or less. And I don't know, but I would assume that there's nothing so special about the EU here. That this shouldn't also travel to the national level, for example, because the arguments that we make here are so general in a way. I mean, yes, of course, the EU is a special political system and it has certain special features, but on a very basic level, it's also a political system, right? That produces policies, that tries to implement policies. So in a way, it's not really that different. I mean, it's elected in a different way and things like that. But in general, I think it's a it's a system of government from which we can also draw some generalizable findings. And for example, this implementation finding is something that I don't see a clear reason why this shouldn't also travel to other empirical contexts, or also the adaptation in the parliament finding, or also, I mean, of course, the idea that preference heterogeneity causes differently complex pieces of legislation. So I think, yes, this is mainly a case study on the EU now, and this was also one of the ideas for the DEMOLAW project, to also put this on a broader basis and to also be able to track this in different political systems, now with a different conceptual approach, but still to make this comparative. This is not what we do here. But in general, I think that there are several things that we can certainly generalize also from those findings. I mean, it's an empirical question. Somebody would have to do it and collect those data on the complexity of national laws, for example. But this always, of course, comes then with language problems, data availability, and so on. But what we have here, in my view, is some sort of a template, that could be adapted and translated to other empirical contexts and used there as well. Then the next question, yes, of course, rule growth and policy complexity. So we had a paper last year together with Yves Steinebach and Christoph in your previous term in regulation and governance, where we actually looked at, oh, something was wrong with my Zoom. Could people actually hear me? Yeah, okay. Where we actually looked at how does this correlate? Does this rule growth thing and the policy accumulation thing actually correlate with the complexity of the individual laws? What we found is no, not really. So you can basically, you can accumulate in a non-complex way, and you can accumulate in a complex way. So those are concepts, and this is what I really take from this paper, that are not really the same. So you can, you can formulate complex legislation, but the substance doesn't have to be complex. You can, the law can be complex, but the substance that is contained in the law doesn't have to be complex. So this is probably also one of the things that we'll still have to explore. We haven't really done this to the degree that I'm really happy with it. So there's really more to do on this. But yeah, essentially, I mean, my core answer here is really that this is not. It's not the same thing. The complexity of the law and basically the complexity of the portfolio, and you had Xavier here who explained something about portfolios, that's really not the same thing. At least empirically, we don't find a clear correlation here.
Okay, yeah. Any more questions? Okay, if not, I will ask the last question, and then we can sum up the meeting. So my question is that if complexity is inevitable, if we might observe it in a lot of different contexts, are there any ways to ease it? Could that be a trend that would be reversed or mitigated in a way? And I mean, we can think about many different initiatives like the better regulation, I mean, the EU context or others in other countries, but those are quite specifically targeting one piece of rule or legislation rather than focusing on the whole picture or the broader rule stocks expansion. So if the latter is the case, and it seems quite reasonably to think that complexity will continue to grow. I mean, is there any way to turn the ship around?
This is, of course, the major question. Yesterday, and it's funny they mentioned it, because yesterday there was this funny headline. I saw this somewhere on social media where it said, the Commission proposes a detailed simplification package. This was one of the funniest things I've ever seen on the internet. This was really, really funny, because it summarizes really the core problem. I mean, we want to simplify, we want to reduce bureaucracy and all of those things, but we've been wanting this for a very, very long time. And, I've got even evidence from, people in medieval England who were unhappy with the complexity of the law back then. So we've always failed with this. So the question is, I mean, you have this broad debate now. You've got Musk and you've got Milei, the people who want to slash everything and, just abolish everything. The key question is, will this make things better? I doubt it. The question is really, can we somehow find ways to also here find a compromise between these excesses in complexity that are definitely detrimental and problematic, and just getting rid of everything. And I'm not the politician who can now really say, oh man, this is the perfect way forward. But I think that we just have to at least have this debate and somehow have to be able to also say, and this is what I meant in the beginning, that we should not always just condemn this complexity, because this complexity also has caused very good things, right? So our social system, for example, in Germany now, for example, is super complex. But, it has also produced a lot of good things, like people being able to have unemployment insurance, for example. I mean, those are complex policies, but, we don't want to get rid of them anyway, nevertheless, despite the fact that they're complex, right? So there has to be, I think, an honest and fair debate on which complexity is necessary and also important and normatively desired, and which complexity is excessive. And I think this shouldn't be a black and white debate. At the moment, my impression is it's a black and white debate, and we should really move away from this.
Okay, fair point. Okay, so thank you so much, Stefan, for this really excellent presentation. We are very happy to have you here, and perhaps in a while, when you have new interesting findings from a project, can come back.
I'd be happy to.
That's great. Okay, so see you next time, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a good day, everybody. And thanks.